Welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing multiple sclerosis. Okay, so we're currently working our way through the story of the pathogenesis of multiple sclerosis. So, we have here our individual who's going to develop this horrible disease, and we've discussed that in order for them to develop this disease, they are going to have to develop an adaptive immune system that is capable of attacking one of the proteins of the central nervous system myelin. And because we don't know the name of this protein, I've given it a name, central nervous system myelin protein. Whatever its identity is, we're going to refer to it as central nervous system myelin protein. Now, we've discussed that the arm of the adaptive immune response that's going to be attacking in multiple sclerosis is the extracellular arm, involving CD4 positive T cells and B cells. We haven't discussed the B cells yet, we're about to. We have discussed CD4 positive T cells, so let me just remind you what we've said. We've said that inside your body you have a huge number of CD4 positive T cell clones that are directed against different peptide fragments. In an individual who's going to develop multiple sclerosis, they are going to develop a CD4 positive T cell clone directed against a peptide fragment of the central nervous system myelin protein. Now, they will develop this clone during childhood because after childhood, the thymus gland atrophies and you do not produce any more CD4 positive T cell clones. So your collection of CD4 positive T cell clones that you have is set after the thymus gland has atrophied, i.e. it's created during childhood. So this is going to fundamentally be a abnormality that develops in childhood. So our individual who's going to get multiple sclerosis, the problem actually starts when they're in childhood. They develop an aberrant CD4 positive T cell clone that may sit in silence for many years, but then years later will cause a problem for them if it's activated and can lead to multiple sclerosis, and we'll discuss that more later on. But it's very interesting to note that this is a problem that's going wrong during childhood. Okay, so the immune abnormality, the ability to have this autoimmune response, is created years before they actually do get it starting to work and attack the white matter of the brain. Okay, and spinal cord. So, let's now talk about the B cells, the other majorly important type of cell in multiple sclerosis. So, we'll go down here to discuss B cells. So, I picked this aquamarine colour, and I'll just sort of come along here. So, let's start by drawing a picture of a B cell. So, it's much the same picture that I'm about to draw as I drew for the helper T cells. So, B cells and T cells look very similar when they're in the naive state. So here is our B cell here. So, again, you have a huge number of different B cells within your body, and these like to hang out in lymph nodes and lymphoid organs like the spleen and lymphoid aggregates, for instance, in the gastrointestinal tract. And if you were to look at all the different B cells in your body, again, they are specifically directed against parts of proteins that could be from a pathogen. It's slightly different, however, to the way that helper T cells and indeed also cytotoxic T cells are directed against proteins. So we saw that helper T cells, those are directed against a specific little peptide fragment of a protein, whereas B cells are directed against a little region of a protein once it's folded up. So let me just draw a picture of this. So let's say that this sort of funny blob thing that I've drawn here, this is representing a protein. So it's a polypeptide that has folded up into its three-dimensional shape. So it's got an incredibly complicated shape because it's folded up into a more advanced shape. Okay? B cells are directed against little regions of proteins. So for instance, the B cell might be directed against this little region of this protein. And we call these little regions of proteins that B cells can be directed against, we call them epitopes. And indeed, B cells, if you know anything about the adaptive immune system, you probably know that they are involved in producing antibodies. So all of the B cells have a unique design of antibody that can recognize a certain epitope of a protein. So all the B cells are directed against different epitopes of proteins. So it's different, basically. Helper T cells are directed against unfolded little peptide fragments, whereas B cells are directed against three-dimensional folded up epitopes of proteins. Now, again, you have a huge number of different B cell clones, so we'll use this term again, the term clones. So remember, a clone of B cells is going to be a collection of B cells that are all directed against the same epitope of the same protein. Okay, so you have a huge number of different B cell clones within your body that are capable of attacking different epitopes. And of course, again, the idea is that you will not create B cells that are directed against epitopes that are present within self-proteins. The idea is you'll only have B cells that are directed against epitopes that are not present in any of your own proteins, but which might be present in the proteins of pathogens, and then you could activate those B cells and use them in the attack of a pathogen with proteins with those epitopes within them. Okay, so you have a huge number of different B cells in your body. B cells are directed against epitopes of proteins. So in an individual who's going to develop multiple sclerosis for one reason or another, and we'll come on and try and discuss potentially reasons that an individual with multiple sclerosis might develop these autoreactive CD4 positive T cells and B cells. But for now, let's just say what we know must happen is that in an individual who's going to develop multiple sclerosis, so our individual here, they are going to develop B cell clones that are directed against an epitope of this CNS myelin protein. So you're going to get helper T cells directed against a peptide fragment of the CNS myelin protein, and you're going to get B cells directed against an epitope of this same central nervous system myelin protein. Okay, now, when we were discussing the development of T cells, I said that actually all of your T cell clones are determined when you're during childhood, when you're a child, i.e. that once you're an adult, your CD4 positive T cell clones are set. It's not the same for B cells. B cells are still produced in adults, because they don't require the thymus gland. B cells are produced in the bone marrow and they also mature in the bone marrow. And adults are still producing new B cell clones. So B cells are different to T cells. T cells, we don't produce any new clones after childhood. We just retain our population of clones that we already have by a slow division process that the T cells are taking part in. Whereas in the case of B cells, we are still producing new B cells, potentially of a whole new different clone throughout our life. However, what's very important to understand is that you cannot activate a B cell that is directed against a certain epitope of a protein without having a CD4 positive T cell activated that is directed against a peptide fragment of that same protein. So CD4 positive T cells, they control the activation of B cells. If you want to initiate a B cell response against a certain epitope of a protein, then you can only activate that B cell that's directed against that epitope if you've already got activated a CD4 positive T cell response that is directed against a peptide fragment of that same protein that you're trying to launch a B cell response against an epitope of. So, fundamentally, even if you were to develop autoreactive B cells attacking or directed against an epitope of one of your own proteins as an adult, if you did not as a child develop CD4 positive T cells that are directed against a peptide fragment of that protein, then you cannot actually initiate that B cell response. So still, I hope you understand that really the adaptive immune response is determined when you are a child, because you can only actually use B cells that are directed against epitopes of proteins that you have a peptide fragment used to direct a CD4 positive T cell against. That didn't properly make sense. It didn't come out quite the way I wanted it to. So you can only use B cells if you have a CD4 positive T cell that's directed against a peptide fragment of the epitope that B cell is directed against. So fundamentally, really, the proteins that you can actually launch an extracellular adaptive immune response against is controlled by your CD4 positive T cell population, and CD8 positive T cells, again, those are determined during childhood, so the intracellular response is also determined during childhood. So fundamentally, the adaptive immune response is majorly determined whilst you're a child. Okay, so let's summarise where we have got to so far in this story. So here is our individual who's going to develop multiple sclerosis. He, as a child, is going to develop a helper T cell clone directed against a peptide fragment of this central nervous system myelin protein. At some point, either as a child or potentially as an adult, he's also going to develop a B cell clone that is directed against an epitope of the central nervous system myelin protein. And potentially, one of the reasons that there is a delay between developing the CD4 positive T cell clone that's directed against the central nervous system myelin protein and you actually developing multiple sclerosis is that you are waiting for the B cell clone to also develop. Alternatively, it might have nothing to do with that. It might be the case that you develop both the CD4 positive T cell clone and the B cell clone that are directed against the CNS myelin protein when you're a child, and then the actual immune response isn't initiated until years later, and we'll discuss what is going to actually initiate the adaptive immune response later on. So you'll see what I mean, how we aren't sure why there is the delay. There are multiple possible reasons. One of them I've given you is that it might be that we're waiting for the B cell clone to come along. The other is that it might be a big delay between actually having the CD4 positive T cell clone and the B cell clone and actually getting them activated so that you can initiate this autoimmune disease. So we don't know which of those is the correct answer, but there is a delay between actually developing the CD4 positive T cell clone directed against a peptide fragment of the CNS myelin protein and the actual onset of the disease. Okay, so what I have told you is what must happen in this individual who's going to develop multiple sclerosis. He has to develop the autoreactive helper T cells and the autoreactive B cells if he's going to develop this illness. Now, before we then move on to how this adaptive immune response is actually activated, because at the moment these helper T cells and these B cells are naive, they're just sitting around doing nothing, they've never actually been activated, you've got a very low population of them and they're not actually doing anything. Before we come on to how that's actually going to be activated, let's talk a little bit about why. Why does this individual develop the autoreactive helper T cells and the B cells? Well, the answer is we don't know. We don't know why some people end up developing these autoreactive helper T cells and these B cells. What we do think plays a role is genetic factors, hugely. A lot of people avoid creating these autoreactive helper T cells and these autoreactive B cells, and there must be mechanisms that they are using to prevent themselves creating an adaptive immune response that can not attack the proteins of the central nervous system myelin, and presumably genetic factors play a role in those mechanisms. So we do acknowledge, and I'll try and put this in here, so squeeze this in here, that genetic factors must play a big role in determining what clones of CD4 positive T cells and what clones of B cells your body can actually produce, and in controlling the mechanisms that stops the production of T cells and B cells that are directed against self-proteins. So genetic factors play a huge role, and indeed we do know that multiple sclerosis has a big genetic component. You're more likely to have multiple sclerosis if you've got a first-degree relative with multiple sclerosis. So it does run in families, we can see that, but it's certainly not simply genetic. It's not the case that there is one gene that if that goes wrong you develop multiple sclerosis. It's not like, for instance, Huntington's disease, which is very simply genetic. It's monogenic, where there's a single gene that if it goes wrong causes the disease. In multiple sclerosis, as indeed with loads of diseases like, for instance, type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes for that matter, loads of human diseases, there is a genetic role, but it's complicatedly genetic. It's polygenic, and I think I'll actually write that keyword down. So it's polygenic. Loads of genes most likely play a role in determining what CD4 positive T cell clones and what B cell clones you actually end up producing in your body. And if you have the wrong combination of loads of them, then it can go wrong and you can end up with autoreactive T cells and B cells. In addition, environmental factors play a role. It's not all genetic factors. Environmental factors are going to influence which CD4 positive T cells and which B cell clones you actually produce. So can I fit this in here? Oh dear. Environmental, there we go. Environmental factors. And I want to talk about one of these that is particularly famous at the moment and which may well have a role in determining which CD4 positive T cells and which B cell clones you end up with. And this is vitamin D deficiency during childhood. So this has received a lot of attention, whether vitamin D deficiency predisposes you to developing multiple sclerosis. If you have vitamin D deficiency during childhood, does that predispose you to developing multiple sclerosis? So I'll put this here. So potentially vitamin D deficiency is one of the famous things that might increase your risk of developing multiple sclerosis, i.e. which might increase your risk of developing these autoreactive T cells and B cells as a child. So let me just discuss vitamin D with you in a little bit more detail to try and justify why vitamin D may play a role in which helper T cells and which B cell clones you actually end up producing. So we'll come down here and I'll just select a new colour. So the first thing to say is that there is not one molecule that is vitamin D. Instead, there are actually 5 different molecules that we call all of them vitamin D. So there is actually vitamin D1, vitamin D2, vitamin D3, vitamin D4, all the way up to vitamin D5. So there's actually 5 separate molecules that all have separate chemical structures that are all referred to as vitamin D. So vitamin D encompasses all of these molecules: vitamin D1, vitamin D2, vitamin D3, vitamin D4, and vitamin D5. Now, the major 2 forms, however, of vitamin D are vitamin D2 and, even more importantly, vitamin D3. So let me give you the longer names for vitamin D2 and vitamin D3. So we'll start with vitamin D2. So vitamin D2 is also called ergocalciferol, and vitamin D3 is also called cholecalciferol. So these are the longer names for vitamin D2 and vitamin D3, which are both forms of vitamin D. Now, both of these forms of vitamin D you can get within your diet. So if you're eating a good, mixed, balanced diet, you'll get lots of vitamin D2 and vitamin D3. And it's important for me to stress right now that all these different forms of vitamin D, vitamin D1 all the way up to vitamin D5, they all do the same thing. The body can use all of these different molecules to do exactly the same thing, which is why we refer to them all as just vitamin D. Now, you might also know from common knowledge that vitamin D can be produced by your body when you go out in the sun. So people often say, oh, I'm sunbathing to top up my vitamin D levels. And the type of vitamin D that can be produced by the skin when you go out and are exposed to ultraviolet radiation is cholecalciferol. So cholecalciferol can be produced by the skin when the skin is exposed to ultraviolet radiation. And the way that it produces it is it actually takes the molecule cholesterol and converts it into cholecalciferol. So the skin can take in the molecule cholesterol, which is a very important lipid molecule. So I'll just put this here. So cholesterol is the starting molecule that the skin starts off with, and it can convert it into cholecalciferol using ultraviolet radiation. So when you go out in the sun, the skin is obviously exposed to lots of ultraviolet radiation, and using the energy from that ultraviolet radiation, it can convert a molecule called cholesterol, a lipid molecule, into vitamin D3 cholecalciferol. Okay, so you can get vitamin D molecules in the diet, and you can also actually produce vitamin D molecules by going out in the sun. The skin can produce it. Now, what does vitamin D actually do? Well, vitamin D is extremely important signaling molecule, actually. We use it to build a signaling molecule. And the way that this works is you firstly activate it in the liver, and you then activate it in the kidneys, and it can then go into cells all around the body and change gene expression. So it actually acts to activate a transcription factor. So let me just explain this in a little bit more detail. So we get vitamin D molecules either from the diet, or we produce them in the skin from cholesterol. What do we then do with them? Well, vitamin D goes to the liver and is converted into something called 25-hydroxy vitamin D. So we have to activate vitamin D before it can actually do anything within the body. So this goes, by the way, the pathway that I'm about to show you is something that occurs for all the different forms of vitamin D. So it doesn't matter whether we're talking about vitamin D1, vitamin D2, or any of the others. All of them have this exact same thing happen to them. This is how the body uses all of them. So, vitamin D then can be converted into something called 25-hydroxy vitamin D, which I will write like so. So 25, and then this stands for hydroxy. It represents the hydroxy group that's been added onto the vitamin D molecule, and then we've just put D there for vitamin D. And this is a conversion that occurs within the liver. So the vitamin D will be in the bloodstream, and then it will go to the liver, and the liver cells will convert it into 25-hydroxy vitamin D. Now, 25-hydroxy vitamin D is not quite yet the active signaling molecule. The active signaling molecule is then made by a further conversion of the 25-hydroxy forms of vitamin D to the 1,25-dihydroxy vitamin D form. Let me just put another dash there. So 1,25-dihydroxy vitamin D. So this is now showing that we've added on two hydroxy groups, 1,25-dihydroxy vitamin D. And this conversion is done by the kidneys. So 25-hydroxy vitamin D goes in the blood again to the cells within the kidneys, and those can convert it into 1,25-dihydroxy vitamin D. So this is the story of vitamin D molecules in our body. We have them in the bloodstream initially, we activate them to 25-hydroxy vitamin D, and then the kidneys are continuously activating them further to 1,25-dihydroxy vitamin D, and then the 1,25-dihydroxy vitamin D plays a regulatory role in the body that we don't fully actually understand. It goes into cells all over the body and is going to activate a transcription factor called 1,25-dihydroxy vitamin D, that's the molecule. It's going to go into the cells and activate a transcription factor called the vitamin D receptor, which for short you can abbreviate down to the VDR. So this stands for the vitamin D receptor. So this is inside of the loads of cells within the body, and when the 1,25-dihydroxy vitamin D binds to this, this can then change gene expression within the cell. It can bind to DNA inside the nucleus of the cell and then change the expression of different genes, and thereby change the behavior of a huge number of different cells. So I'll just complete up my little flow diagram here. So it changes gene expression in a huge number of cells, and therefore changes the behavior of those cells. Changes gene expression. Okay, so this is occurring all the time if you are getting enough vitamin D. So if you've got adequate vitamin D, the liver converts it into 25-hydroxy vitamin D, and then the kidneys convert it into 1,25-dihydroxy vitamin D. So you've always got a little bit of 1,25-dihydroxy vitamin D in your bloodstream. This is going into cells all over your body, activating a receptor inside those cells called the vitamin D receptor. This is then binding to DNA, and changing the expression of genes, so changing which genes inside the cell are actually being expressed and to what level, and therefore changing the amounts of different proteins that you're producing inside that cell. And if you change the proteins inside the cell, you can of course change the behavior of that cell. So, one very famous example of vitamin D in action is in the control of calcium, and this is the best understood function of vitamin D, but you have to understand that this is going into cells all over the body continuously and altering gene expression. So this is something that should be there all the time, and which is playing obviously some very important regulatory role within the body that we don't fundamentally understand yet. And you can hopefully therefore understand that if you had even a mild little deficiency of this, it might change your body big time. It might lead to strange development, especially if it was in childhood. It might affect your development. Indeed, it might affect the development of your immune system. So it is plausible that deficiency in vitamin D could affect the development of the adaptive immune system. However, before I come back to that again, let me just give you the absolutely incredibly famous example of where vitamin D is extremely important. So the place where everyone knows that vitamin D is very important is in calcium management, because we know that vitamin D deficiency can lead to things like rickets, where you've got problems with the bones and it's caused by problems with absorption of calcium due to problems with vitamin D signaling. So let me talk you through how vitamin D is important in calcium handling. So, calcium then, where should we fit this in? We'll fit it in over here. We'll put it over here. So, calcium. Calcium is an extremely important ion that is present within the blood and which is present within the extracellular fluid that surrounds cells at a certain level. And it is very, very important to maintain the concentration of calcium within the blood and extracellular fluid at an exact level, because this calcium being at that exact level is important in the functioning of nerve cells, in the functioning of the heart muscle cells, and in the functioning of skeletal muscle cells. And if calcium levels start to change, this can lead to problems with the functioning of nerve cells and the functioning of heart cells. So it could lead to big problems with brain functioning or big problems with heart functioning, and therefore it could lead to death if it goes too wrong. So, the body needs to control the level of calcium within the blood very, very carefully. Now, vitamin D is very, very important when calcium level within the blood and the extracellular fluid goes too low. So, I'm now going to talk you through the signaling pathway that is present to try and bring calcium level back up in the blood and extracellular fluid if it goes too low. So, we start off then with calcium level within the blood and also extracellular fluid. And remember that the level of calcium in the blood is in equilibrium with the amount of calcium in the extracellular fluid, because calcium is a tiny little ion that can easily diffuse across capillaries. So, the calcium level in the blood is the same as the calcium level in the extracellular fluid. So, we're going to monitor calcium level in the blood, but that's our way of monitoring calcium level in the extracellular fluid, and it's the calcium level in the extracellular fluid that we're really interested in, because it's the heart cells and the brain cells that are bathed in the extracellular fluid calcium. Okay, so let's say calcium level goes down within the blood. What actually detects that the calcium level goes down in the blood? It is the parathyroid glands. And by the way, what I'm telling you here, it's not particularly relevant to our discussion of multiple sclerosis. It's just a little bit of background about vitamin D so that you've got a sort of good picture about vitamin D, because there is a lot of talk about how vitamin D might be very important in multiple sclerosis, and I want you to have some understanding about vitamin D. But this isn't directly relevant to multiple sclerosis. Okay, so when calcium level goes down within the blood, this is going to be detected by glands called the parathyroid glands. And these are tiny little glands. You have 4 of them, and they're behind the thyroid gland in the neck. So just drawing a little picture here then. So the thyroid gland sits in the neck, and it has this sort of shape. like so. So it has two lobes, one on either side. We're imagining we're looking from the front, so this is the left side and this is the right side. And then it has a little connection between the lobes. And it's sitting in front of the trachea as it goes through your neck. So it's sitting in front of your windpipe. So the windpipe would be in this sort of position here. So this is representing the trachea. And indeed, you can feel your trachea at the front of your neck. If you go above your sternum, then you can feel your trachea there. And if you go up a little bit, you might be able to feel your thyroid gland further up in your neck on either side of your trachea. It's not very comfortable to feel your trachea. That's how you know you're actually feeling it. Okay, so the thyroid gland is the gland in the neck, sitting on either side of the trachea like so. We're not interested in the thyroid gland, however, we're interested in the parathyroid glands, and these are tiny little things compared to the thyroid gland. You will not be able to feel these, at least you should not be able to feel these. These are sitting behind the thyroid gland in these sort of positions like so. They're tiny little blobs sitting behind the lobes of the thyroid gland, and you have 4 of them in total, as shown on this picture. So, tiny little glands called the parathyroid glands, literally meaning parallel to the thyroid gland, sit behind the thyroid gland, and these are monitoring all the time what the calcium level in the blood is doing. If the calcium level goes too low, they kickstart into action basically, and they release a hormone into the blood called parathyroid hormone. In fact, they are releasing this hormone all the time, but they hugely increase their release of this hormone in response to calcium going down. So they have a hormone called parathyroid hormone, which I'll abbreviate down to PTH, and they're secreting it all the time at very low levels. However, when calcium goes down in the blood, they say, right, this is the signal we've been waiting for, we need to do something, and they produce a huge amount of this hormone called parathyroid hormone and secrete it into the bloodstream. And this is a protein hormone that they're producing here. Okay, so parathyroid hormone, this protein hormone, is secreted into the bloodstream, and what does parathyroid hormone go and do? It goes down to the kidneys. It does more things than just this, but we're interested just in its relation to vitamin D, so we'll talk about this major function of parathyroid hormone, but be aware that I'm not giving you the quite full story. It does do other things as well, but we're interested in what it does as far as vitamin D is concerned. It goes down to the kidneys and activates the kidneys and says, look, I want you to start converting much more of the 25-hydroxyvitamin D into 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D. So it activates the kidney's conversion of 25-hydroxyvitamin D into 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D. So you've got lots of 25-hydroxyvitamin D floating around in the blood usually that is being converted very slowly into 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D. When the parathyroid hormone goes up hugely because the parathyroid glands have secreted it in response to the low calcium, the kidneys say, right, we've received this order, we're going to now convert this at a much faster rate, and loads of the 25-hydroxyvitamin D floating around in the blood gets converted into 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D. So in response to low calcium, 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D goes right up within the bloodstream, and this is now going to, of course, go into cells all around the body and activate the vitamin D receptor and change gene expression. And one of the big sites that this takes action is in cells within the gastrointestinal tract, particularly the enterocytes of the epithelium of the small intestine. So, drawing a little picture of this then. So down here, we're now looking at a specific cell. So let's just draw a little part of the gastrointestinal tract. So this is meant to represent the esophagus, this is meant to represent the stomach, and then we have a part of the small intestine here. That'll do as far as my picture is concerned. So this is representing part of the small intestine here. So the lumen of the small intestine is lined by epithelial cells called enterocytes that have this basic shape here. So this is their luminal side, so the lumen of the small intestine is here, and then this is their basolateral side facing into the wall of the small intestine. And it looks a little bit odd without a nucleus, so I'll give it a nucleus. These little finger-like projections are to increase its surface area, and these are known as microvilli. Okay, so here's our enterocyte that lines the small intestine. I'll put on its name here. So it is an enterocyte. So the epithelial cells of the small intestine are called enterocytes. Entero means pertaining to the intestine, cyte means cell, so it's a cell of the small intestine. And these, of course, control the absorption of nutrients across from the lumen to the basolateral side where the blood vessels are here. Now, when vitamin D goes up in the blood, it changes the gene expression within these enterocytes and causes the production of loads of proteins that are involved in absorbing calcium from the lumen of the intestine, and therefore calcium absorption across the intestine epithelial cells hugely increases. So vitamin D going up suddenly in the body causes a massive increase in the amount of calcium that you're actually absorbing from your dietary intake. And of course, this solves the problem. It's going to bring up calcium levels within the extracellular fluid. So why have I talked about that? It's interesting physiology. It's very important for calcium homeostasis. However, I talked you through that to give you an example of how vitamin D is used as a signaling molecule within the body. So let me summarize what I've now told you about vitamin D. So vitamin D, we've seen how there are 5 different forms of vitamin D, 5 separate molecules that are all called vitamin D, and they all do exactly the same thing as far as biological function is concerned. The 2 major forms are vitamin D2 and vitamin D3. In particular, if you're going to just remember one, remember vitamin D3. Vitamin D2 is called ergocalciferol, vitamin D3 is called cholecalciferol. Remember this one's name. Both of these forms of vitamin D you can get from the diet. Cholecalciferol you can also produce in the skin from cholesterol when the skin is exposed to ultraviolet radiation, i.e. when you go out in the sun. The vitamin D that you're getting into your bloodstream is then activated in the liver to 25-hydroxyvitamin D. However, this is still not the active form. The kidneys can then convert it into 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D. Now, usually they're doing this at a very slow rate, so you get only a little bit of 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D in your blood, and this goes around the body and activates vitamin D receptors and does change gene expression in loads of cells in the body, and this is important. It's playing an important regulatory role. The normal amount of vitamin D will be determining your body's health, and if you're developing, if you're growing, your body's development. So I will put this here. Okay, important in development and health, fundamentally. So you don't want to be deficient in vitamin D, otherwise this signal regulation, this regulatory functions that vitamin D is doing, this ticking over of gene expression that vitamin D is doing will go wrong, and you will encounter potential health problems. One of the really important physiological and well worked out, well understood things that vitamin D does, because a lot of what it does isn't understood, but one of the really well understood things that it does is involved in calcium homeostasis. When calcium goes too low in the blood, the parathyroid glands release parathyroid hormone, and this leads to a huge increase in the active form of vitamin D, the 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D. It activates the kidneys' conversion of 25-hydroxyvitamin D into 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D. So in response to too low calcium, your active vitamin D goes massively up within the bloodstream, and this, one of the major places that it works to bring calcium up is it changes gene expression in the enterocytes that line the small intestine here and cause them to hugely increase the amount of dietary calcium that they are absorbing, because usually a lot of dietary calcium isn't absorbed, so they hugely increase the dietary calcium that's being absorbed to bring back up the calcium level within your bloodstream to prevent problems with the heart and problems with the nervous system. Okay, so my message here: vitamin D is a very, very important molecule that we don't understand completely yet. We don't understand any of biology completely. Vitamin D we certainly don't understand completely. It is present, the active form is present in your body all the time and is changing gene expression in cells all over your body. So it is very, very understandable that it will have a role on your health and it will have a role on your development. So if you are vitamin D deficient during childhood, this may well influence the development of the adaptive immune system, and it may well predispose you or increase your risk of developing CD4 positive T cells and indeed B cell clones that are directed against your own proteins, in particular in the case of multiple sclerosis, this CNS myelin protein here. So, at present, this is not something that we are absolutely sure of. This is something that is gaining a lot of attention, however, that potentially people who are vitamin D deficient during childhood, and I should just put that here, in childhood, its thought is very, very important. Slightly vitamin D deficient during childhood, not necessarily to the level that it causes rickets, but just slightly deficient in vitamin D during childhood, that this might make it much more likely that you will develop these autoreactive T cells and B cells, and hopefully you can understand potentially why that might be the case because of this massive regulatory role that vitamin D seems to have. It may well influence the development of the adaptive immune system and which clones of T cells and B cells you're actually going to end up with. But we don't know, which is why I've put a question mark there. We are not absolutely sure of this. But it may well be the case that this does increase your risk for multiple sclerosis. So, we're going to have a break here. Let me just summarise where we have got to now. So, we have our individual here who's going to unfortunately develop multiple sclerosis, and for genetic reasons and also environmental reasons, potentially he was slightly deficient in vitamin D during childhood, he is going to develop an adaptive immune system that can attack the CNS myelin protein, i.e. he's going to develop CD4 positive T cells that are directed against a peptide fragment of this CNS myelin protein, and B cells that are directed against an epitope of this CNS myelin protein. The CD4 positive T cells will have to develop during childhood. The B cells might not necessarily develop in childhood, they might develop in adulthood, although they might develop in childhood. We don't quite know when they develop. Indeed, if they develop in adulthood, that might explain the lag between actually developing the CD4 positive T cells that are autoreactive and actually getting the disease. However, we think that there might be another explanation as to why there is the lag. So we're not sure when the B cells actually develop. It may be the case that they develop in childhood, or it may be the case that they develop much later. Okay, in the next video, we will turn on to how does this individual who now has the adaptive immune system that can result in multiple sclerosis actually get this immune response activated, and then how does it actually attack the white matter tissue within the central nervous system. So I'll see you in the next video.